1764, when Johnson was 55. Early in 1764, Johnson paid a visit to the Langton family at their seat of Langton in Lincolnshire, where he passed some time, much to his satisfaction. His friend Bennet Langton, it will not be doubted, did everything in his power to make the place agreeable to so illustrious a guest. And the elder Mr. Langton and his lady, being fully capable of understanding his value, were not wanting in attention. He, however, told me that old Mr. Langton, though a man of considerable learning, had so little allowance to make for his occasional laxity of talk, that because in the course of discussion he sometimes mentioned what might be said in favor of the peculiar tenets of the Romish Church, he went to his grave believing him to be of that communion. Johnson, during his stay at Langton, had the advantage of a good library, and saw several gentlemen of the neighborhood. I have obtained from Mr. Langton the following particulars of this period. He was now fully convinced that he could not have been satisfied with the country living, for, talking of a respectable clergyman in Lincolnshire, he observed, "This man, sir, fills up the duties of his life well. I approve of him, but could not imitate him." To a lady who endeavored to vindicate herself from blame for neglecting social attention to worthy neighbors, by saying, "I could go to them if I would do them any good," Johnson said, "What good, madam, do you expect to have in your power to do them? It is showing them respect, and that is doing them good." He's very into decorum, this Johnson. So socially accommodating was Johnson that once when Mr. Langton and he were driving together in a coach, and Mr. Langton complained of being sick, he insisted that they should go out and sit on the back of it in the open air, which they did, and being sensible how strange the appearance must be, observed that a countryman whom they saw in a field would probably be thinking, "If these two madmen should come down, what would become of me?" Soon after his return to London, which was in February, was founded the Club, which existed long without a name, but at Mr. Garrick's funeral became distinguished by the title of the Literary Club, in capitals. Sir Joshua Reynolds had the merit of being the first proposer of it, to which Johnson assented, and the original members were Sir Joshua Reynolds, Dr. Johnson, Mr. Edmund Burke, Dr. Nugent, Mr. Beauclerk, Mr. Langton, Dr. Goldsmith, Mr. Chamier, and Sir John Hawkins. They met at the Turk's Head, in Garrick Street, Soho, one evening in every week at 7, and generally continued their conversation till a pretty late hour. This club had been gradually increased to its present number 35. After about 10 years, instead of supping weekly, it was resolved to dine together once a fortnight during the meeting of Parliament. Their original tavern having been converted into a private house, they moved first to Prince's in Sackville Street, then to Les Telliers in Dover Street, and now meet at Parsoles, St. James Street. Between the time of its formation and the time at which this work is passing through the press, June 1792, the following persons, now dead, were members of it: Mr. Dunning, afterwards Lord Ashburton, Mr. Samuel Dyer, Mr. Garrick, Dr. Shipley, Bishop of St. Asaph, Mr. Vesey, Mr. Thomas Warden, and Dr. Adam Smith. The present members are you ready? I know you want to know this. Mr. Burke, Mr. Langton, Lord Charlemont, Sir Robert Chambers, Dr. Percy Bishop of Doramore, Dr. Barnard Bishop of Killaloe, Dr. Marley Bishop of Clonfert, Mr. Fox, Dr. George Fordyce, Sir William Scott, Sir Joseph Banks, Sir Charles Bunbury, Mr. Wyndham of Norfolk, Mr. Sheridan, Mr. Gibbon, Sir William Jones, Mr. Coleman, Mr. Stevens, Dr. Burney, Dr. Joseph Warden, Mr. Malone, Lord Ossory, Lord Spencer, Lord Lucan, Lord Palmerston, Lord Eliot, Lord Macartney, Mr. Richard Burke, Jr., Sir William Hamilton, Dr. Warren, Mr. Courtenay, Dr. Hinscliffe, Bishop of Petersburg, the Duke of Leeds, Dr. Douglas, Bishop of Salisbury, and Boswell as the Beeve. Oh, and it says Boswell, the writer of this account, so Boswell. Sir John Hawkins represents himself as Sir John Hawkins is the guy, don't forget, that Boswell hates because he wrote The Life of Johnson, and it's his competing biography. So, Sir Joseph Hawkins represents himself as a successor from this society, and assigns as the reason of his withdrawing himself from it that it in late hours were inconsistent with his domestic arrangements. In this he is not accurate, for the fact was that he one evening attacked Mr. Burke in so rude a manner that all the company testified their displeasure, and at their next meeting his reception was such that he never came again. He is equally inaccurate with respect to Mr. Garrick, of whom he says, quote, he trusted that the least intimation of a desire to come among us would procure him a ready admission. But in this he was mistaken. Johnson consulted me upon it, and when I could find no objection to receiving him, exclaimed, he will disturb us by his buffoonery, and afterwards so managed matters that he was never formally proposed, and by consequence never admitted. End quote. In justice to both Mr. Garrick and Dr. Johnson, I think it necessary to rectify this misstatement. The truth is that not very long after the institution of our club, Sir Joshua Reynolds was speaking of it to Garrick. I like it much, said he. I think I shall be of you. When Sir Joshua mentioned this to Dr. Johnson, he was much displeased with the actor's conceit. He'll be of us, said Johnson. How does he know we will permit him? The first Duke in England has no right to hold such language. However, when Garrick was regularly proposed some time afterwards, Johnson, though he had taken a momentary offence at his arrogance, warmly and kindly supported him, and he was accordingly elected, was a more agreeable member, and continued to attend our meetings to the time of his death. Mrs. Piozzi has also given a similar misrepresentation of Johnson's treatment of Garrick in this particular, as if he had used these contemptuous expressions. Quote, if Garrick does apply, I'll blackball him. Surely one ought to sit in a society like ours, unelbowed by a gamester, pimp, or player. Really didn't like those actors, said Johnson. But I, Boswell, am happy to be enabled by such unquestionable authority as that of Sir Joshua Reynolds, as well as from my own knowledge, to vindicate at once the heart of Johnson and the social merit of Garrick. In this year, except what he may have done in revising Shakespeare, we do not find that he labored much in literature. He wrote a review of Granger's Sugar Cane, a poem, in the London Chronicle. He told me that Dr. Percy wrote the greatest part of this review, but I imagine he did not recollect it distinctly, for it appears to be mostly, if not altogether, his own. He also wrote in the Critical Review an account of Goldsmith's excellent poem, The Traveller. The ease and independence to which he had at last attained my royal munificence increased his natural indolence. Let me read that again. The ease and independence to which he had at last attained by royal magnificence increased his natural indolence. So he has like a little pension, so he's doing jack shit. In his meditations, Johnson thus accuses himself. Quote, Good Friday, April 20th, 1764. I have made no reformation. I have lived totally useless, more sensual in thought, and more addicted to wine and meat. I can relate to that. And next morning he thus feelingly complains, My indolence since my last reception of the sacrament has sunk into grosser sluggishness, and my dissipation spreads into wilder negligence. My thoughts have been clouded with sensuality, and except that from the beginning of this year I have, in some measure, forborne excess of strong drink, my appetites have predominated over my reason. A kind of strange oblivion has overspread me, so that I know not what has become of the last year, and perceive that incidents in intelligence pass over me without leaving any impression. Now, coincidentally enough, I quoted this part one time on Facebook, without really knowing much about Sam Johnson at the time, so it's funny that I almost have that part memorized in my head because I remember posting that. Because I could relate. He then solemnly says, "This is not the life to which heaven is promised." And he earnestly resolves an amendment. It was his custom to observe certain days with pious abstraction, viz., New Year's Day, the day of his wife's death, Good Friday, Easter Day, and his own birthday. He this year says, "I have now spent 55 years in resolving, having, for the earliest times almost that I can remember, been forming schemes of a better life. I have done nothing. The need of doing, therefore, is pressing, since the time of doing is short. O God, grant me to resolve aright, and to keep my resolutions for Jesus Christ's sake. Amen." Such a tenderness of conscience, such a fervent desire of improvement, will rarely be found. It is surely not decent in those who are hardened in indifference to spiritual improvement to treat this pious anxiety of Johnson's with contempt. About this time he was afflicted with a very severe return of the hypochondriac disorder, which was ever lurking about him. He was so ill, as notwithstanding his remarkable love of company, to be entirely averse to society, the most fatal symptom of that malady. Dr. Adams told me that, as an old friend, he was admitted to visit him, and that he found him in a deplorable state, sighing, groaning, talking to himself, and restlessly walking from room to room. He then used this emphatical expression of the misery which he felt: "I would consent to have a limb amputated to recover my spirits." Yeesh. Talking to himself was indeed one of his singularities ever since I knew him. I was certain that he was frequently uttering pious ejaculations, for fragments of the Lord's Prayer have been distinctly overheard. His friend Mr. Thomas Davies, of whom Churchill says, "that Davies hath a very pretty wife," when Dr. Johnson muttered, "Lead us not into temptation," used with waggish and gallant humor to whisper Mrs. Davies, "You, my dear, are the cause of this." He had another particularity of which none of his friends ever ventured to ask an explanation. It appeared to me some superstitious habit which he had contracted early, and from which he had never called upon his reason to disentangle him. This was his anxious care to go out of it or in a door or passage by a certain number of steps from a certain point, or at least so as that either his right or his left foot, I am not certain which, should constantly make the first actual movement when he came close to the door or passage. So he's a little OCD. Thus I conjecture, for I have, upon innumerable occasions, observed him suddenly stop, and then seem to count his steps with deep earnestness. And when he had neglected or gone wrong in this sort of magical movement, I have seen him go back again, put himself in a proper posture to begin the ceremony, and, having gone through it, break from his abstraction, walk briskly on, and join his companion. A strange instance of something of this nature, even when on horseback, happened when he was on the Isle of Skye. See my journal, The Tour of the Hebrides, to find more about that. Sir Joshua Reynolds had observed him to go a good way about rather than cross a particular alley in Leicester Fields. But this Sir Joshua imputed to his having had some disagreeable recollection associated with it. Oh, that reminds me, I was supposed to... Let me check something here. No? Okay, I'm fine. Listerfields, right? Is that how you pronounce it? Listerfields? So Joshua imputing to him having had some disagreeable recollection associated with it. Oh, my book's already falling apart. Look. Oh, it's not good. Still got so much to read in here. It's funny, it always seems like it's... I mean, he's already 55. How much more can we go? But yeah, he lives a good long life. I mean, for... maybe not for nowadays, but for the 1764s, I would imagine so. That the most minute singularities which belonged to him, and made very observable parts of his appearance and manner, may not be omitted, it is requisite to mention that while talking, or even musing as he sat in his chair, he commonly held his head to one side towards his right shoulder, and shook it in a tremulous manner, moving his body backwards and forwards, and rubbing his left knee in the same direction, with the palm of his hand. In the intervals of articulating, he made various sounds with his mouth, sometimes as if ruminating, or what is called chewing the cud, sometimes giving a half-whistle, sometimes making his tongue play backwards from the roof of his mouth, as if clucking like a hen, and sometimes protruding it against his upper gums in front, as if pronouncing quickly, under his breath, "tu, tu, tu." All this accompanied sometimes with a thoughtful look, but more frequently with a smile. Sounds like he was probably a loud eater, too, doesn't it? Generally, when he had concluded a period in the course of a dispute, by which time he was a good deal exhausted by violence and vociferation, he used to blow out his breath like a whale. This, I suppose, was a relief to his lungs, and seemed in him to be a contemptuous mode of expression, as if he had made the arguments of his opportunity fly like chaff before the wind. I am fully aware how very obvious an occasion I here give for the sneering jocularity of such as have no relish of an exact likeness, which to render complete he who draws it must now disdain the slightest strokes, But if witlings should be inclined to attack this account, let them have the candor to quote what I have offered in my defence. He was for some time in the summer at Easton Modded, Northamptonshire, on a visit to the Reverend Dr. Percy, now Bishop of Dromore. Whatever dissatisfaction he felt at what he considered a slow progress of intellectual improvement, we find that his heart was tender and his affections warm, as appears from the following very kind letter. To Joshua Reynolds, Esquire, in Lister Fields, London. Dear Sir, I did not hear of your sickness till I heard likewise of your recovery, and therefore escaped that part of your pain which every man must feel to whom you are known as you are known to me. Having had no particular account of your disorder, I know not in what state it has left you. If the amusement of my company can exhilarate the languor of a slow recovery, I will not delay a day to come to you. For I know not how I can so effectually promote my own pleasure as by pleasing you, or my own interest as by preserving you, in whom, if I should lose you, I should lose almost the only man whom I call a friend. Pray let me hear of you from yourself or from dear Miss Reynolds. Make my compliments to Mr. Mudge. I am, dear sir, your most affectionate and most humble servant, at the Reverend Mr. Percy's at Easton, Modded, Northamptonshire, by Castle Athby, August 19, 1764, Sam Johnson. Footnote here about Miss Reynolds, Sir Joshua's sister, for whom Johnson had a particular affection, and to whom he wrote many letters, which I have seen, in which I am sorry her too nice delicacy will not permit to be published. Ooh. Then there's a footnote from a later editor. A number of these have since been published. And that's it for today and for that year. That's the whole of we've got of 1764. So not a big gloomy year for Johnson. Makes him somewhat relatable, I suppose. Well, until next time, bye from Boswell.